Cool. Well, but let's make a start. As we agreed, I mean, I'm German, so I like time boundaries. Which is funny because...
Oh, we're Swedish, we love it.
Which is funny because in a lot of my coaching, I try to take time kind of out of it, but then in other parts of my coaching, it's very much there and quite short, because when endings are in sight, the meaningful stuff comes out, right? Yeah. But like in parts of what I'm offering, I took time out of, like I block a number of hours and we very rarely get to the end of it. And this is interesting existentially in terms of like what time means to us and endings particularly. But I still have a German in me, so it's 20 past, we agreed to wait 5 minutes, so let's start. I'm going to start with this. And it's not a question for you, it was a question for me. By a client who came in for a consultation. And that was one of the first questions that he asked me. And the interesting thing is that he had come in to lose weight and get in shape. But so I, as you do, I didn't give him a straight answer, but I did. I said, well, I'm very happy to give you a straight answer because coaches kind of, I think, have that a bit more than psychotherapists or the stereotypes of such. And I said, but before I tell you, I'm really interested why you're interested in that. And then it came out that he wanted to use weight loss and getting back in shape as starting to get into an upward spiral, but really he felt a bit empty in his life. And he had a sense that, he called himself an atheist and said he had a profound sense that there is no profound sense. So I'm very sure, we only just started, but I'm sure that this will come back up because it often is underlying all of our actions and behaviors that we do or don't do. So it's a starting point, and this is, I think, it's a useful thing to bring up because in coaching very often there's a presenting issue. There's something that is presented to you as a coach, and once you build a relationship, it's almost always connected to something that is underlying this stuff. So that's what I want to talk about today a little bit. Everybody's searching for meaning in some way or another. It's not just for people who aren't able to cope anymore. It's for everybody. Everybody is looking for that meaning. Frankl talked about people's will to meaning. So we want this to make sense, Coaching has been exploding. There's an exploding number of coaches. I've been in this for quite a number of years now, and it seems every day there's new coaches, and it covers such a broad spectrum now. And I want to talk a little bit about traditionally it being performance and results oriented, and there's been a shift to include almost whatever you want. So hence from performance to asterisks, and I'll say a bit about that later. I think there's a big meaning crisis coming up with the fourth industrial revolution. Everything's getting automated. I think there was this Oxford study that 48% or something of jobs will just disappear. Of course there will be new jobs, and maybe 2040 is not the number, but we're facing massive automatization, which means lots more free time. I think it's likely to have some sort of unconditional basic income, but we're going to have a lot of people who have the potential to be very bored. And when people get bored, it gets really dangerous. So I'm worried about that. Other people not so much, other people extremely, and there's differing opinions out there that I come across from people I highly respect. So we don't really know, and existentially we always live in that uncertainty of not really knowing what's to come. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of optimism, and we just don't know where it's going, but people ask themselves those questions. I got contacted by a guy from Egypt, and he said the new generation in the Middle East, they're asking themselves those questions. They want to question, but they come from a culture where questioning is not really ingrained. It's often frowned upon. Just accept. And we have that here as well. Do as you're told rather than questioning. It makes life easier to a certain extent. But then in a world that's changing constantly and in a speed that is unprecedented, we can't help but question because it's going to be thrown into our face. We can't ignore it anymore. We can't hide in our little village and that equivalent of the traveler passing by and opening your mind and being radically different happens every day on the internet. There's somebody with radically different opinions and we're being challenged. So there's a need to ask those questions, and clients do want to go deeper. You know, they come for coaching, but what we often call therapy through the back door. So where does a coach come in? At what point does he have to stop? You know, at what point will she need to refer a client? You know, how far can we go as coaches, and where's the difference between coaching and other practices? So that's the overview. What is coaching? What is meaning? And I'm going to move quite quickly because I see these conferences as a conversation, and this particular presentation has gone through a couple of stages just within the last 24 hours. Even just 5 minutes ago I put in another slide, and you'll see about that. But like, I will presuppose you've seen Emmy van Dersens and Roy Baumeister's lecture, so I'll skip through a lot of this stuff. Not skip, but go through it quite quickly to really show the meeting points between coaching and meaning-centered practices. And I want to talk a little bit about existential coaching as one of those. And a bit on ethics, just in terms of when we cross boundaries as coaches, as practitioners, there's always a lot of questions we should ask ourselves to keep our clients' selves and ourselves as well. If we have time, perhaps you can talk a little bit about coaching and psychedelics. I have some ideas on that. I'm not practicing with psychedelics. I wouldn't recommend it or condone it in any way. But there's tremendous research coming out in the use of psychedelics in psychotherapy. And there was this study that people have equated the psychedelic experience as in the top 5 of their life experience, along the line with the death of their parents, the birth of their child, or their wedding. So there's potential, like it's intricately linked with meaning making, and I think there's a space in coaching, but like I would like to explore that if we have a bit of time. So coaching, traditionally performance-oriented, results. It came from sports, and then it moved into, in the 90s with Whitmore, moved into organizations, but more and more it moved into transformation, meaning-making. So there's a real shift, not necessarily a shift, because the spectrum has been broadened, but it's not just anymore just for performance, even though some coaching only focuses on performance, and that's very valuable, but it's been growing. Definitions of coaching vary considerable. I came across hundreds. From the immediate improvement of performance and development of skills by a form of tutoring and instruction, up to the spectrum of, this is Whitmore's, of unlocking potential, you know, helping to learn rather than teach, all the way to what Emmy wrote in her book on existential coaching, together with Monica Hennaway. Existential coaching focuses particularly on existential issues, including meaning and purpose. So it's for people to help them live with greater deliberation, liberty, understanding, and passion. You know, so that opens another end of the spectrum that wasn't there in coaching, which is usually focused on results and action. And this doesn't say there's no action and results from it, but it specifically helps people make sense of the world. And this is so integrative. This could be a lot of approaches. This is not necessarily, people would read that, and if you don't add coaching to it, you could say, well, that's therapy, isn't it? So the lines become very blurry. And that is a good thing in many ways, but also a challenging thing in many ways. Particularly with, like, I had so many students who are trying to find their way as coaches, and it's confusing. Because especially I have a lot of students who say, well, just tell me what coaching is and how I'm supposed to do it. You know, ideally in a weekend. And there's people who offer that. You can do 1 weekend of coach training and then you call yourself a coach. You don't even need a weekend of training to call yourself a coach, but then you just study one process and you take people through that process, and it's valuable. You know, and they get results. But I think there's so much more to it. So I want to help people get that. I like the Hans model of relational coaching, which very simply has 2 spectrums, from suggesting to exploring and confronting to supporting. This is how we can respond to whatever we're being faced with in the coaching room. You know, my natural area is probably on the confronting, exploring end, but I think every good coach will go to wherever is needed, depending on what the client is trying to achieve or trying to avoid. So sometimes you just need to be very supportive, because there just is no time to confront or explore at this time. You know, there is space for recommendations, putting something on the table. This is what's helping a lot of people. What do you think? You know, if you have that eye-level relationship with somebody and you manage your power dynamics, you can put something on the table and say, hey, research says this is helping a lot. You know, oh, I'm struggling with focus and this and that. Is like, have you thought about that? Have you done any form of meditation? Have you come across it? Because I just know that helps most people. You know, so why wouldn't I put it on the table for them to consider? You know, we all have a training hat if we know a bunch of stuff. You know, and so many coaches come to my supervision and they feel guilty and ashamed for having given a piece of advice. You know, when actually that was incredibly helpful and welcomed and so often expected from coaching clients. So there's a place for that. But then the boundaries get blurry. This is how Farley and Stout try to make sense of it, asking questions, giving answers. The client is expert versus the client with you as the expert. I think there's a lot of, if you look at that and you don't have questions and you don't have critical opinions, I'd be a bit disappointed. But the reason I'm showing this is just as one way to try and make sense of it. In reality, what I hear from coaches, and not just from the university coaches, I teach at a couple of other coaching schools and I'm part of a couple of groups where there's coaches from all over the world, including intuitive coaches, the ones that have never read a book and never done any training, and they just intuitively help people. You know, and they also can call themselves coaches. That's the beauty of an unregulated profession. But in reality, it often looks like this. You know, it's a term that spans to everything. So that resulted in definitions like, I've heard, coaching is a powerful conversation that helps you become the best version of yourself. That could be any process. Coaching is making people's lives better. Chocolate makes people's lives better. You could sell it for $3,000 maybe, you know. So, meaning-centered work, should it be coaching, therapy, should it be something else? I find this really helpful. This is from my friend Nesh Popovich's book. There's good starting points to think about the difference between coaching and therapy. As your clients, usually coaching works with people who are resourceful and whole, who are generally have it together or are doing quite well and they want to better themselves. Whereas therapy usually works with people who are broken or suffering, you know, they need treatment. Not always the case, obviously. Many people go to therapy to just explore at a very deep level, you know, but it's perhaps a starting point and there's a tendency for sure. Same with time. Mainly coaching works with the present and the future, going forward. Whereas therapy often works with the past, exploring the past, making sense of the past and who you are in the present as a result of it. So again, that's not necessarily true. Solution-focused coaching and solution-focused therapy are pretty much identical if you ask the practitioners. Just that the coaches earn more money is a joke I often make. But it's again not true necessarily, but a good starting point. Same with the focus and depth, that coaching works more with performance, with surface, with behaviors, with change, with actions. Whereas therapy works with transformation, with healing, with character transformation, with deep understanding of self. And again, depending on approach, that's not necessarily true, but it's a good starting point. If we put these three together, we can get somewhere. You know, there's certainly tendencies. Again, coaching breaks out of that room. But it's just useful to start thinking about where are those lines, if the lines even exist. I think it's a big blurry area between the two. So, the goals of coaching, I'm sure I left many out, but what you hear often when you look at that, learning, performance, action, results, understanding, but then it gets a bit more complicated or complex. Transformation, working on your relationships. What does success mean to you? It's not only financial success. Often it's not about financial success. But what does it mean to be a successful person? You know, it means something different to everybody. So the starting point is usually raising awareness through conversation. So where's meaning in that? Often come from a positive psychology background, so often people come for coaching for happiness, for well-being. I'm not satisfied with my life right now, or I want to be happier. I want to create some kind of happiness. In my experience, no matter what somebody comes in, and this is so far 100%, at the end of every goal that was ever presented to me is some form of well-being or happiness. So I want to take a quick look at the well-being theories, just to kind of underline that point. Seligman, for example, talks about PERMA, talks about positive emotions, engagement, finding flow, positive relationships, meaning, a purposeful existence, and achievement, a sense of accomplishment. we've heard about from Carol Dweck this morning, psychological well-being, more personal growth, like the self-acceptance. We also have the positive relationships in there. We also have purpose in there. But what I really like is self-acceptance. Again, perhaps more in the therapeutic area, but more and more coaches definitely work with that. You don't have to have problems as such to struggle with that. You know, often it's masked or not really voiced. So what comes out when you open the coaching space, often this longing for self-acceptance. Personal growth is so coaching. You know, you want to be better at something. You know, that is perfectly in line with the performance stuff. There's a couple of others, like for example, health and safety that have been added by other people. Meaning and purpose is one pillar of that. So whatever was brought to me was always connected to one of these factors. And just take a moment. How many coaches are in the room here? Okay, it's about half. Does that resonate? Can you think of somebody that went outside of that?
One of my complications is I referred people for coaching from the organisation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's actually, so the context is quite mobile. And actually when people are referred to me for coaching, the first thing is they're trying to make sense of what the hell's going on and why they've been referred.
Exactly.
So actually it becomes about meaning making rather than about what the referrer wants them to do.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I'll talk a bit about work in organizations later, but it is about meaning making. It's about making sense. So let's talk about meaning a little bit. We have that existing meaning versus a given meaning. The one that's created versus the one that exists. So there's this interesting double meaning in German for the word Sinn, sense. And even there's a double meaning in English for sense. Because on the one hand, it's the thing that is a rational process, making sense of something. On the other hand, we sense something. It's something that we feel, that we perceive. You know, so it's the same in German. The word Sinn, something can be sinnlos without any sense. It doesn't make sense. But we also perceive the world through our 5 senses. So we have that rational versus the felt one. You know, the global versus the situational, the meaning of life versus the meaning in life. So the meaning of life, many religions, many books, many spiritual institutions or leaders, gurus, they will tell you there is a sense. You know, and there is an overarching thing that we might not be able to understand as human beings, but it's there. You know, it's out there, we can find it, we can believe in it, and whether we believe in it or not is, I think, a very personal thing. But it's certainly out there that there is an overarching meaning for this whole human existence. I googled everything is connected, and this came up. The second thing that came up, the second thing that I'm going to skip this. You know this guy, right? He wants to really believe that there's something out there. Mulder from the X-Files. The second picture that came up for the meaning of life is 42. Just a big picture of a 42. And if you're familiar with the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that is the answer to the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. Because they asked a supercomputer in the future, and then it calculated for a billion years or so. And then they come back to it and they said, so what is the answer to the meaning of life, the universe and everything? And the supercomputer said, 42. Oh. So people went and started to make sense of that. And I said, well, 42 is the alphanumerical sum of 2B. So B is the second letter in the alphabet. If you put that all together, it's 42. How clever. The asterisk, I said coaching is is asterisk. It's whatever you want it to be. Because in the computer coding language, ASCII, an asterisk is depicted as 42 in code. And it usually stands for, you use it for something that is later replaced. It stands for whatever you want it to be. So if you know computer programming, and that is a computer that they have asked, it makes a lot of sense that, the meaning of life is 42, which means the meaning of life is whatever you want it to be. I'm like, oh, that's amazing. Douglas Adams is so clever. That's 42 characters in the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. So that's another theory. And when I heard this one, I'm like, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's just like, I definitely. And he said, the answer to this is very simple. It was a joke. It had to be a number, an ordinary, smallish number, and I chose that one. Binary representations, base 13, Tibetan monks. You know, it's all complete nonsense. I sat at my desk, I stared into the garden, and thought, 42 will do. Typed it out, end of story. We find meaning, you know. Mr. Natural, what does it all mean? It don't mean shit. Maybe it does all mean something, but we certainly, you as human beings, are making sense quite automatically. So the existentialists say, well, life is absurd. You know, there's only the meaning that we make. And you could say, well, life is often absurd. When you hear Emmy speak, it doesn't sound like life is absurd. It sounds like there's a truth. And they had that positivism slide up there. You know, the truth is out there for us to be found. But we live in postmodern times where a lot of people now think, well, reality is what we create. All reality is created. So there's this interesting, sometimes paradox, sometimes people can hold them both. But like, that's definitely out there. By the way, there's 23 characters with spaces in Meeking. We do that automatically. There is no triangle. When we see this, we automatically think this. When actually, there's a greater whole to this. Very quickly, just check your mental imagery and your assumptions as you're reading through this tiny little story. You probably see some trick question coming, but like, we do make sense of stuff all the time, which is very useful. It's a very useful skill, but it often fools us as well. So, as far as I'm concerned, I don't know if there is a meaning of life. I can choose to believe it, that everything is connected, and there's a lot of evidence out there that, you know, things are greater than it seems. There's so much we don't understand. Maybe if I do this now, somewhere on the other side of the universe, life will be different. You know, maybe everything I do matters. At one point in the lecture, somebody said, whatever I think is going to echo through the universe for eternity. So I wrote down donkey balls and had a little smile. But we create it, right? You create it. We can influence our meaning. Yesterday I played music, and before I said a few words that changed the meaning. You know, we can do that. So we live in these times where there is still objective facts. I don't deny that at all. You know, I think we have taken this too far. But certainly, we are socially constructing things through language, through our stories, through context, you know, through talking through each other, talking to ourselves, language we use with ourselves. So that's the meaning in life. In German we say Bedeutung. There's Sinn and Bedeutung. Bedeutung means literally pointing, but like it's the act of attaching a point to something. So there's an intention of somebody. So if somebody says something, the 6-9 analogy, and there's two people standing on different sides, like, no, it's 6, no, it's 9. Somebody intended this to be a 6 or a 9. That's important, you know? But we don't know if we don't have the context, so we're creating context all the time. Frankl said, for the meaning of life differs from man to man, from day to day, and from hour to hour. What matters, therefore, is not the meaning of life in general, but rather the specific meaning of a person's life at a given moment. That's not only therapy, that's everybody. So coaching is for everybody, almost everybody, you know, depending on how we work with this. But certainly that spectrum that has been left out of having relationships designed to help people make more sense of the world or better themselves in any way. So meaning is a choice. I'm going to go through some of these slides quite quickly just because I'm aware of time and I'd love to have some time for questions. There's Seligman and Peterson who said, well, the concept of learned optimism. There's an explanatory style, not as an optimism everything's going to be all right, but I can make sense of the past and the present in an optimistic way. You know, it can be about me, it can be lasting forever or be very quick. You know, when I fail an exam, it can be my fault or the teacher made it too hard. You know, I'm going to fail school and academically I'm stupid versus, you know, maybe I'm just not good at math. You know, this is not going to last forever, and the next exam I'm doing better again. That's a very optimistic view of making sense of stuff. And we can use that in coaching by helping people to become aware of their explanatory styles and then being more active in making a different sense of this. There's the VIA classification of character strengths. It's a survey where you can find out what your character strengths are based on Seligman and Peterson's research into virtues. They grouped 24 character strengths over 6 virtues. And so very, very much connected to values, what's important to us. So we can do a character survey with a coaching conversation afterwards, and then you can have a conversation about what's important to you and how does that show up in your action day to day and your behaviors. How can you use your character strengths in different ways at work or in your relationship? You know, because if we have a lot of research now that if we do what we're naturally good at, we're going to feel better. There's a range of positive effects that it has. Fantastic for coaching. Very much about making sense of who you are. You've all heard about mindsets, I assume. You know, focusing on the process, on learning, or focusing on the outcome. We can use that in coaching. Viktor Frankl, again, his discovering meaning by accomplishing a task. We've seen Seligman's PERMA model. The A is for accomplishments. Experiencing something fully. So there's a lot of work with mindfulness in coaching. And an attitude of embracing suffering. So the second wave of positive psychology, Paul Wong has been a big figure in that. My colleagues at the former colleagues at UEL. Positive existentialism, as I call it, you know, bringing positive psychology and existentialism together. Even Jordan Peterson talks a lot about embracing suffering, and you may think of him what you will. I certainly do. But like that attitude of embracing suffering, because that's just part of human existence. You know, that's very existential. You can't avoid it. I'm going to skip that, but it's a process of helping people to make sense of stressful events. You know, and this is not post-traumatic growth necessarily. You know, people come to me all the time in coaching having experienced something stressful. But you can see it's about making sense, about accepting that that is, giving it new meaning, you know, through a perception of what's good about it, how it changes your identity, getting a reappraised meaning, changing your global beliefs, and changing goals. Goals are so coaching. You know, we talk about purpose. Roy Baumeister in his talk yesterday talked about continuity. So there's a lot of coaching work around narratives and life scripts. It's not only a therapy thing anymore. You know, we make sense of who we are through the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. You know, that's super interesting, super powerful work. And continuity is part of meaning, as he told us. Seeking stability, especially now in this VUCA world. You know, there's constant change, and that's really difficult to manage. So we seek stability. It's really difficult to hold that uncertainty. We have that natural urge to seek stability.
What does that stand for?
Oh, it's for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Conflict. There's conflict all the time. Not just conflict as in like violent clashes in words or even physical, but we're all different people. We all have different opinions. Nobody's exactly the same, so we're all existentially at conflict with each other. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a really good thing, because we need an antithesis to our thesis to grow. So, but in coaching, a lot of people come to make sense of that kind of conflict. Because we don't like conflict. We search peace of mind, but we also search growth and change. And there is no change without conflict. How do I live a good life? How can I be a good person? Essential questions for somebody who doesn't just come for performance, but even performance has inherent in it, I want to be a good person and perform well. You know, so that morality aspect that comes in, very often in coaching, the conversation gets deeper very quickly. So Heidegger's idea of what is meaning versus how do I approach or relate to my meaning. So on that spiritual dimension that Emmy was talking about, you know, how do I make sense towards meaning? How can I exist? And how can I relate to making sense of myself and my relationships on all these different dimensions? I'm going to skip these. You just see we can work with meaning in the past, we can work with meaning in the present, and we can work with meaning in the future. Particularly that work around finding a why. You know, it's both in businesses. Simon Sinek has done a lot of work around that, but Frankl and Nietzsche both have said that if you have a why to live for, you can bear almost anyhow. but also if you have a shared purpose, something to focus on in the future, in coaching that makes everything stronger. You know, people in coaching search for their why all the time. You know, if we don't listen to these meanings, then we miss powerful work that we can do with people. You know, this is where our striving, our motivation comes from. Creating value goals, things that are important to us. They drive us, they give us energy. We feel like we accomplished something that's meaningful. And we all want that. So purpose, George and Park talk about purpose as making sense, having valued goals, and as mattering. That's coming from their research. So a good coach will address all of these. You know, it's a powerful process. And when we can connect to that sense of purpose, then people take less sick leave, people work harder, people connect more, they show more passion, they create things, their well-being goes up. If their well-being goes up, they get ill less. You know, it's good on so many levels, but some people just don't feel like they have a purpose. And there's a way that we can help them create that if they want to. You know, I've seen complete nihilists get in touch with something that actually matters to them. You know, and often that's a conversation, and sometimes it's a very quick conversation with a couple of powerful questions. And that's the essence of coaching. Have a conversation, ask some powerful questions. Somebody goes, I'd never considered that. And all of a sudden they have they opened the door into a potentiality for meaning, which is what Heidegger is very much talking about. That shared purpose, if you create that, the first thing that you do, I had the conversation this morning, the guy who runs the camera operation, he's also been studying at MIT, and he's a consultant for early stage startups. You know, it's a lot more to people than we sometimes think. And he said the first question that he asked is, have you been talking about that? And 2-3 stages down the line is mission statement, values, shared goals. You know, that's what you want to talk about before the money comes into a startup. Very, very important, because as soon as the money comes in, it changes. You want to have that shared purpose. You want to know what your values are. So everybody can get behind that. That's the driving force. If that's the driving force, it can be a very successful operation. And if that is the money, and for some people it is, I don't think it's a good idea, but for some people it is the amass of money. I think that's a problem, but it still works. If everybody comes together to make money, then you have like a Jordan Belfort kind of operation in Wolf of Wall Street. That worked, you know, that's why it worked, because everybody was there to make money, you know. But you see all of these positive factors, you know, you innovate more, there's more motivation, teamwork, less sick leave, you know, can manage crisis better because you have something that bounds you together as a group. Millennials struggle, not struggle with that, but there's this thing about millennials that they put so much more importance on meaning. You know, it should mean something what I'm doing. And that's important to that generation. And that generation takes over more and more space in organizations as the next generation kind of retires. So it's going to become more and more important, and that's why coaches really need to focus on that. So coaching I see as a vehicle from knowing what is meaningful, because a lot of people have a pretty good idea what's meaningful and important to them when you ask them, to actually taking action on that. And this is where the action component comes in. You know, making choices to actually embody that meaningful life that you kind of know. Maybe first you need to create it, but it's very rare in coaching that somebody comes in and they see absolutely no point in existence. And they can't even begin to think about what's important to them. You know, you ask some questions, people are generally quite switched on, and then you have that conversation. But coaching is a managed process to help people take action and bring things together, you know. I have a slide on coherence there somewhere. Authenticity, being aligned with your values and your actions. You know, because if you do something, if you have a certain job, or you act as if something matters to you, but actually your internal dialogue is very different, or you really believe in something, but the things that you do daily just doesn't match that. That's really difficult, because we create conflict, an inner conflict. So a lot of coaching does focus on that, bringing things together, making it more aligned. And that's a wonderful process, because once people realize how important that is and how good it feels, and they're doing that, they get into that upward spiral, and sometimes everything changes from that. Their whole life kind of focuses on something that they decide is personally meaningful to them. Sometimes they decide that this universal meaning that they believe in completely aligns what they do. You know, and whatever that is, that's subjective. You know, I can't take anything away from that. You know, I'm not religious, I'm not following a certain book, but if somebody does and that focuses their life for the better, great, that's fantastic, because there's so much energy in that, you know? So in that sense, it's difficult to say, well, that's the truth, you know, because I come from a scientific background, and it's that you can't prove that there's one God or 3,000 or that there aren't, you know, it's just that's maybe at some point we'll be able to, but at this point, you're just going to have to choose to believe in it. Atheists are also believers. So a few words on existential coaching as a meaning-making process. There's a lot more to existential coaching, but there is a huge pillar on meaning. And there's a lot more to a person than performance. This is Emmy's, I think she had that slide, well, slightly different, that's a different slide, but like, I like to show that in a sphere because that physical world, that Umwelt, is really our first contact with the world. You know, our physical body is our first line of experiencing the rest of the world. You know, how we relate to other people within the center is our spiritual world, is how we make meaning of things in ourselves. First, she had it in a pyramid. So here are neatly the paradoxes, the existential paradoxes. And here's Emmy earlier, who's taking Baumeister's categories of meaning, and they really nicely overlap with those four worlds. You know, that sense of self-worth, of purpose, of value, and efficacy. You know, that's not just physical as well, it's also efficacy in jobs. You know, as having a sense that what you do matters, that you know, you can do things well and efficient. So here's one of the models. Existential coaching is very young, really. The first book came out 2012, and right now there are only, I think, 6. Anne has just written one in Swedish. Thank you very much. I found one in...
You just written one.
I just written one. There's one in French that I was also not able to read yet.
Spanish.
In Spanish?
In Spanish,
Ooh,
yeah.
you gotta send
From
that to me.
Latin America.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so we're growing. But all quite recent. 2012 is nothing when it comes to science or philosophy or new approaches. So it's really developing. But the mover model by Monica and Jamie, it doesn't start with meaning necessarily. You know, you tend to start with contracting and deciding on who is what responsibility, who takes what responsibility. But meaning is a big factor, not just making sense of things, but also talk about what's meaningful to you personally. Existential coaches would often not just read between the lines, but often have a very open conversation about that kind of thing. So again, what is meaning versus how do we approach it? How do we relate to it as a core process in existential coaching? Sometimes open, sometimes underlying. I mentioned authenticity, that kind of paradox between wanting to fit in versus wanting to be yourself. That can be really difficult to hold because we do want both. We want people who are talking, Shimon was talking about the communal aspect. You know, we cannot have meaning, he says, without relating to other people. We cannot have meaning by ourselves without relating to a community in a positive or negative way. So fitting in is a human need. We're social animals, right? We want to relate, we need to relate. It's really difficult for us to be disconnected, as we heard earlier. But we also want to be ourselves, we want to be special, and we cannot help but be individuals. So that's something that we need to come to grips with. You know, how do I live an authentic life? How can I be coherent in thought, feelings, and actions? That sense of existing towards death, we don't have that much time. And we actually don't know how much time we have left. And if you bring that into the awareness of a client, and this could be something very small, like the end of a meeting, the end of a job, the end of a degree, the end of a relationship, you know, the end of a day, the end of a sandwich. You know, for some people, the end of a sandwich is really difficult because they're never going to have that experience again, even if they buy the same sandwich on a different day. So the way that we relate towards endings is the way that we relate towards endings of our whole lives. You know, the end of a sandwich can remind us of the end of our lives, and that brings into an awareness of time, and that can be a really powerful driver for people. You know, if we would live forever, oh, I didn't even see that. Thank you. If we would live forever, why do anything now? You know, so deadlines are so important. I just started an online course and realized that's way too flexible. You know, people want deadlines. And I'm like, oh, tap into their intrinsic motivation, and people are eager to learn. No, most people really need deadlines in order to get stuff done. And I'm one of those. Some things happen, many things don't happen if you have plenty of time to do it. So in coaching, we can really work with that. There's plenty of interventions if you're an intervention kind of person, but also just pointing out, like sometimes in a session I'm like, oh, we've got 20 minutes left. And all of a sudden all of this stuff comes up and I'm like, whoa! The first time was an accident, and then sometimes I used it more strategically. And it's really interesting what it does when you point out that there's an ending. So this is our second to last session. I'm curious about what you wanted to talk about today. Just bringing that into awareness is really good. Really big nod to Paul Wong, who's bringing this meaning community together for 20 years now. He talks a lot about responsibility. And responsibility is a big part of existential coaching. That any coaching, I think it's so important to contract, to sit down and have a conversation about the conversation, to co-create the space. I have some of my rules, like, I need you to do this and this and this is your responsibilities. I promise to do this and this and this, these are my responsibilities. Is there anything that you want, anything that I still want? How can we co-create this coaching space together? So important, because you can fall back on that in difficult situations. For example, when you need to refer. I always tell my clients, look, there's a certain line, I don't know exactly where that is. I can go fairly far into depth, but at some point I know this is not coaching anymore and I'm not the best person for you to work with. So whenever that line is crossed and I know I can feel it, I'll promise to you I'll bring it up in the most respectful way, and I make sure that you're working with the best person possible. You're communicating care rather than rejection. It's important. So there's many other approaches to this that go beyond traditional boundaries, and that's good. I think that's a good thing. But we need to ask ourselves a couple of questions about when do we need to stop. Because there's many very overconfident coaches that think they can coach anybody and anything on everything. And that's really worrying for me. Because I'm quite naturally reflective, but not everybody is. And I've seen, sometimes, people approach me, or I've seen questions in groups posted, hey, coaching community, there's somebody with type 2 bipolar and has been 20 years of depression, and they've been diagnosed with chronic anxiety. What do you think is the best tool to use? Somebody came in to me for supervision, and we had a longer conversation about this, and it actually turned out that person was in really good hands in terms of treatment, and they wanted to work on some very practical issues, and there was a space for coaching, but you needed to be very careful with boundaries. And that coach decided to take that person on, but they had a very long conversation around at what days can it happen, and under what circumstances, and how would we manage when these lines are crossed. And they had a very good contractual agreement on what things to work on and when would it not be possible. So there is a space for that, I think. But you have to be very, very, very careful. Ethics, and we had that word on ethics, is like, that's not just no's and what you can't do. It's really a series of questions that you need to ask yourself constantly. And if you work with challenging clients and challenging boundaries, complex boundaries, you need to ask yourself all the time constant questions. And one of my trainers, Jamie, who's also wrote one of the books, he kept saying, this client cost me so much in supervision. Everything I earned through this client, I brought straight to my supervisor. So I'm like, what am I doing this for? So that happens, and that person who came to me for supervision, she actually took this client on pro bono, and I'm like, you're realizing how much you're investing in this. And she had her reasons, and I really appreciated that because she really wanted to help, but there's other questions involved in that. But yes, how do you choose a coach? Ask if you're somebody who wants coaching and wants to go on a deep journey, ask your coach some questions. Where are those boundaries? Not every coach contracts them well. What is your training? How do you have experience? How does your process work? A good coach will be able to tell you a bunch about their process, and they should do from the beginning, but I know from experience not all coaches do. But it's really, really important if the coach doesn't do it and you as a client doesn't ask, it can be a really, really difficult space and maybe even dangerous, because you never know. If people come to you and they open up, And all of a sudden stuff comes up that you had no idea, and you couldn't have any idea that that's there. And all of a sudden childhood trauma comes up, or this comes up, or that comes up, and then you don't want to reject them, and it becomes a really difficult conversation if you hadn't had that conversation in the beginning that, look, there are lines, there are boundaries, this is my framework for coaching.
Get the boundaries.
Wasn't there a 2-minute one?
Oh.
Oh shit. Okay, so we skip that. Please come talk to me about it. Take home messages. Actually quite good timing. Love in German. Meaning is a multifaceted construct. It's a continuous process and often automatic. Healthy, normal people, and I hate saying that, but like if you look at under the bell curve, everybody's looking to find or make meaning. So coaches can, or actually cannot help but contribute to meaning making, depending on at what levels that is. Coaching takes you from knowing what's meaningful to living what's meaningful. Choose your coach wisely, and check out Existential Coaching. I wrote a book about it. There's still 2 copies left downstairs, by the way.
Sold out though.
No, there's 2 hard copies, which are quite expensive. I'm sorry about that, but I ran out of copies. You guys just grab them all. Please stay in touch, because I like having these conversations. There's some free books on my website. There's some training coming up in 2 weeks. If you wanted to learn more, here's where you can get me. And also, by the way, Yannick Jacob, Coaching in the Quest for Meaning is what.
Cool. Thank you, Yannick. I think we have 42 minutes left now.
42 minutes. Oh, I'm sorry about that.